Good evening, everybody. My name is Tracy Carluccio. I'm Deputy Director of Delaware Riverkeeper Network, and thank you very much for joining us tonight. We're going to be discussing a problem in Delaware that hasn't been exposed as much as some other states to public scrutiny, although some places where PFAS are known to be a problem have been very aware of it in Delaware. So we've been doing research for the last several months, and we've pulled together information that we wanted to share tonight. I have to say it's kind of a lot of information, so I'm going to move through a slide presentation pretty efficiently, and then we'll have some questions and answers at the end. I am not a PFAS scientist. I am an advocate. So I might not be able to answer all your questions, but I'll be able to tell you where to go to get an answer, and I'll do the best I can. So why don't we begin now, and I'll bring up my slideshow, and we'll move through it. And then, as I said, at the end, we'll have some time for questions. Okay, tonight we're talking about Delaware's PFAS problem. And this is a public forum where we're going to be looking at PFAS just within the state of Delaware. So first of all, what are PFAS? Well, per and polyfluoroalkyl substances, a mouthful, PFAS, are a group of synthetic chemicals, and they include some of the most commonly found PFASs, which are PFOA and PFOS. And those are particularly in the Delaware River watershed found most frequently. And they're widely distributed across the world. Everybody has some PFAS in their blood, and even polar bears are found to have PFAS in their blood. So it's spread by air, it's spread by water, and by other media. They're often called forever chemicals, and that's because they don't break down. Once they're here to stay, and that's part of the big problem here. There are other PFAS or PFAS compounds found commonly or in some circumstances within the Delaware River watershed, for instance, greater than in other places, and those include PFNA and also PFHXS, which we're going to talk about a little bit tonight too. So where do they come from? Well, they were used in a lot of industrial and manufacturing and firefighting applications. And they've been used for decades. And as you can see here on the slide, Teflon was one of the common products that where PFASs, particularly PFOA, was used and released into the environment as a result of manufacturing using PFOA. Non-stick papers, stain-resistant and water-resistant fabrics such as the 3M Corporation Stainmaster, and then also firefighting companies, foams used by companies. And these firefighting foams contain PFOS and some of the other PFAS compounds, and they were used extensively and still are actually at airports and also at military bases. And that has made military bases a major source of contamination nationwide, and also a major source within the state of Delaware. Many consumer goods have these products within them, but they're also released to the environment through manufacturing and firefighting foams. So how do people get exposed? Well, it's released during, for instance, a manufacturing process or the use of firefighting foams out into the air. And maybe you've seen some pictures of the foam floating in the air, but it actually is odorless, and you can't really see it in the air, but it is contained in the foams that were used. It settles on the soil, it settles on vegetation, and then percolates down and gets into water sources, such as our groundwater, and then also gets onto surface water, and that way moves into the ecosystem, into fish and wildlife, and then into people from drinking water. The major pathway of exposure for humans is by drinking water. Also, you're exposed through food and consumer products. It is used to line many products that we drink from or eat from. And 82% of Delawareans get their water from community water systems. And so you're at risk of exposure to PFAS. And also on top of that, 2/3 of the public water systems in Delaware draw from groundwater. So we know that PFAS stays in groundwater once it's there. So it poses a problem for public water systems and also for private water wells. So how do they threaten your health? Well, PFAS build up in the body. And just like they build up in the environment, bioaccumulate in the environment, they also build up in human blood. They build up in your liver and your kidney. And because of that, you can be exposed to even very small amounts of PFAS, but and in your drinking water, for instance, but these tiny amounts build up in your body over time and pose a problem. Scientists estimate that levels in a person's blood are at about 105 times the amount that's in their water, and that's because it accumulates in our blood. And these tiny amounts then concentrate in your blood serum, and they then can rise to levels that are known to have adverse health effects. And that increases the risk of developing diseases that are linked to these toxic chemicals. So that's sort of the rub here. Builds up in your body and then poses a toxicity risk. So PFAS, just what are these risks? They're correlated with diseases, and they've learned this by examining the links between human exposure and the incidence of disease. They were really exposed through a discovery by Rob Bilott in West Virginia and Ohio, where the DuPont Washington works released tremendous amounts over many decades of PFOA to the environment, got into people, and many people developed diseases that are considered to be linked or correlated with PFOA. And in order to investigate this, there was a C8 panel put together. That's what they called it. C8 is PFOA. That means it has 8 carbon atoms. And that C8 study looked at the people who had been exposed. And so they looked at thousands and thousands of people. And they found that the incidence of these diseases on this slide were higher amongst those who had high levels of PFOA in their blood. So kidney cancer, testicular cancer, thyroid disease, high cholesterol, pregnancy-induced hypertension or preeclampsia, and ulcerative colitis. This is all what they discovered in that study that they did. We're fortunate that scientists have been able to use the information in order to develop these links, because otherwise it's very difficult to know how are humans affected. And there's very few chemicals that you actually have this sort of human exposure data in real life, because of course it's unethical to expose people to a toxic material to find out what it does. This unfortunately was a terrible trauma for the people there. And their misery has led to some scientific advance that perhaps will prevent others from experiencing the same thing. There are other effects that are being discovered, and particularly from other PFAS compounds as well. But for PFOA, low infant birth weight, it affects your immune system. And there's also a decreased vaccine response, which is very interesting and scary in the time of COVID. So all of this information, I have links on all these slides. We're going to be posting it on our website in the next few days, probably by the beginning of next week. And you'll be able to go to these links and get this information, read the source documents, because we believe in that, and you'll learn even more, much more than you're going to learn in an hour tonight. So PFAS, how do we remove them and how do we regulate them? Well, the technology is here, and And fortunately, it's affordable and it's in use. Basically, granular activated carbon and reverse osmosis are the two methods that are most used. And there are other technological advances that are today developing other sorts of removal methods or filtration or destruction methods in order to get these chemicals out of water so drinking water can become safe again. The way that you test for these is established. EPA has actually adopted drinking water methods for testing for many PFAS, so that's established. And we know that in order to control it and remove it from water, there must be regulation in order to require water systems to remove this. But there's no excuse not to do it. You can't say the technology isn't there. You can't say you don't know how to test for it. And we do know it has health effects. So there's really no reason not to move ahead and regulate it. Now I do want to say, and I'm going to go through a couple slides on this, not to get too heavy into the weeds, but Delaware Riverkeeper Network believes that we really should be going for a non-detect. That means take it all out of the water. You know, nature didn't put it there. Human beings put it there. It's a synthetic chemical, and it doesn't belong in our drinking water. Now, we have engaged experts to look at what would be the maximum contaminant level or the safe drinking water standard that state water systems should be required to remove from water in order to make it safe. And our experts said, well, 1 parts per trillion for PFOA, you could go up a little bit from that. And you might not have a big increase, but the safest is 1. And then also for PFOS, it should be somewhere between non-detect and less than 5. And that's based on a risk assessment using scientific methods that are accepted by the Environmental Protection Agency and are used by all scientists. So the important thing to know here is that you can detect it down to 1, it depends on the lab, between 1 and 3 parts per trillion. So essentially, if you're removing it into the low single digits like that, you're removing it to non-detect. So EPA issued a PFOA, PFOS 70 parts per trillion health advisory. That is a 70 parts per trillion level of PFOA and PFOS singularly or combined is considered by the EPA to be safe. So as long as you stay below that, the EPA says that you're okay. We don't agree with that, and many scientists don't agree with that. Many states don't agree with that, and I'm going to go through that a little more here. You can look at New Jersey's, for instance, health effects report at this link, and you'll see in great detail why this HAL is not protective of human health. But just to quickly give you sort of a thumbnail reason that the EPA health advisory level is not protective is because if you actually drink water that has up to 70 parts per trillion in a concentration of PFOA in the water, you're going to still be increasing by 5 to 8-fold the amount in your blood. And this is very dangerous because we've discussed health effects are known below the level that the 70 parts per trillion would build up to in your blood. So you're actually exposing yourself to a greater risk of disease by drinking water that has up to 70 parts per trillion concentration of PFOA in it. And there's a greater vulnerability for infants and also for the fetus because infants drink more water, young children drink more water than adults. So they actually get more of the PFOA and other PFASs in their blood. And there are health effects that include developmental defects that come with the higher levels of PFOA in your blood. We talked about that a little earlier with low birth weight and other problems that children can experience. And then what happens if you're exposed if fetus is exposed or young children are exposed at those levels, they can then um, either be scarred for life with some defect, or down the road, they could develop a disease that's linked to the compound. Um, and, uh, and that, of course, is totally unacceptable as well. So New Jersey decided in their health effects subcommittee that these increases are not acceptable, and they're not protective of public health. And they concluded that there were several reasons that the EPA's 70 parts per trillion was arrived at that were just not scientifically correct. And it includes things such as certain endpoints that are well established were not considered by the EPA, and this is in human beings. Also, increases in the human serum PFOA levels that were expected from exposure to 70 parts per trillion, that's what NGL means, as compared to serum PFOA levels associated with human health effects were not considered. That's what I just talked about. And then also, our Delaware Riverkeeper Network's expert that we engaged in order to study this problem says that we must adopt standards that protect our most sensitive subpopulations. And that goes with what several of the states have done as well. And that should include women who are planned to become pregnant, so women of childbearing age as well. So I want to say, and this is unfortunate, but Delaware is lagging behind other states in regulating. There are no federal drinking water quality standards for PFAS, and none are nationally listed as hazardous waste or hazardous substances, or regulated by Superfund or the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act. A petition was actually filed by organizations earlier this year in order to make that happen at the federal level, but the EPA has not done that at the federal level. 9 states have more stringent drinking water standards than the 70 parts per trillion HAL, and that's either mandatory standards or guidance values. And the HAL was considered insufficient in those studies that were done in order to set those standards in the 9 states that do have stricter standards than the federal MCL or maximum contaminant level. A lot of other states have addressed groundwater and drinking water. They set remediation levels and effluent limits. And Delaware has taken some action. I'm going to talk about that in a minute. But in terms of regulation and mandatory action, Delaware has not done that yet. And also, another important development in the science on this is in 2018, the Federal Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Registry, the ATSDR, set what's called minimum risk levels for PFOA, PFOS, PFHXS, and for PFNA. That's a non-carbon, highly toxic PFAS substance. That can be converted into drinking water concentrations through some calculations that you do. And when you do that, the levels are magnitudes lower than the EPA's health advisory level. So that's really important to understand that also the federal ATSDR has set levels. Now, these are not drinking water standards, but they're minimum risk levels that are used to calculate standards that when you calculate it out, comes down to a much, much lower level than the 70 parts per trillion that EPA has set. So what does Delaware have in place in terms of maximum contaminant levels or safe drinking water standards? States are all required to apply the Federal Safe Drinking Water Act, and Delaware does that by mirroring the EPA's maximum contaminant levels for various toxic compounds. And all of those that are adopted by the federal government are the same and apply in Delaware. However, neither Delaware nor EPA have any of these safe drinking water standards or maximum contaminant levels for any PFAS. As a matter of fact, the EPA has really been asleep at the wheel when it comes to unregulated chemicals. There are tens of thousands and maybe even into the hundreds of thousands of unregulated chemicals in use in our world today. And since the standards were set and the maximum contaminant levels established for many of these compounds in 1998, there has not been new ones adopted. Now, it was actually 1997 adoption, and then one for E. coli was updated in 1998. So since 1998, they haven't adopted any new MCLs. So, our concern here is that not only is the HAL, the health advisory level, not good enough. It's just an advisory level. It's not mandatory. And there is really nobody at the federal government that is setting mandatory, protective, safe drinking water standards that then could be, safely applied at the state level. So what has Delaware done? Well, the state of Delaware has adopted drinking water hazardous, well, first of all, adopted drinking water program. And then also they have addressed hazard substances. So the Source Water Assessment and Protection Program, or SWAP, was created by Congress when the Safe Drinking Water Act amendments were adopted in 1996. And it's managed in Delaware by DNREC, the Delaware Department of Health and Social Services, the Division of Public Health there, and the University of Delaware Water Resources Agency, the Institute for Public Administration. And that was set up back then. And Delaware's regulated contaminants or maximum contaminant levels are same as the EPA, and you can find them under the Division of Public Health. That's where those regulations are. And they will list all of the MCLs that the federal government has, linking to that at the federal government. And then also Delaware has taken other action. Delaware has adopted under the Hazardous Substance Cleanup Act for the state that PFOA and PFOS are added to the hazardous substances list. That was done in 2018. And it lasts for 3 years, I believe it is. And they next year would be due to update it or continue it. And this gives DNREC the power or the authority to compel sampling of groundwater and surface water throughout the state. And they have set a regional screening level that they use as the threshold or the benchmark that these substances, when they're found, have to meet. And again, it's the EPA HAL, or 70 parts per trillion. Now, important to understand, this is a good step. It allows them to sample, and we certainly need the information. We need the data in order to understand what are the sources of contamination. There's probably a lot of them we don't know about. Where is it exactly? There's probably a lot of people drinking water that has high levels, even above the EPA HAL in it, and we don't know it because we haven't tested every single private well, for instance. So we need this information, and it is important that they've done that. However, the regional screening level is not a regulation. It is simply giving the authority to DNREC to do the sampling. So we feel it's absolutely essential that the public knows. The public needs to know. We need to know about PFAS contamination in the state. And I have several slides here, and I'm gonna go through them kind of quickly because there are a lot of information. But like I said, we're gonna be putting this up on our website, so you'll be able to download it and look at it a little more carefully. And eventually, a few months from now, we hope to actually have a report as well and further forums on this. But I just wanna point out that we have 3 known sites that Delaware, as a state, has been grappling with. And the first one, Blades groundwater site, you may know about. There's a lot of public interest in that. People were shocked when they were told not to drink their water and given bottled water instead. Newcastle County Air National Guard in the airport area also is a known source of high levels of PFAS, and Dover Air Force Base. Those last 2 are mainly from firefighting foam. These wells and groundwater that have been tested have been found to have PFAS above 70 parts per trillion back in 2014, when the first samples were ordered by the EPA for their unregulated contaminant monitoring rule 3. And that's when a lot of places found out they had this problem and they really didn't know it, or nobody was talking about it before that. And this data here is back from 2014, and it shows the 3 samples that they had taken and what the levels were. Remember, we talked about 70 not being good enough. Look at these levels: 2,700, 153. And the Newark one apparently has been taken care of now, but in the first, and all of these have been addressed, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But when it was first found, it was a shock. I'm sure it was a shock to the state regulators. It certainly was a shock when people found out, which in many instances wasn't until well after 2014. Let's look quickly at the Blades groundwater site. This is in Sussex County. It's next to the town of Seaford. And in 2018, the levels there for PFOS and PFOA combined were between 96 and 187 approximately parts per trillion. And that was in all 3 of the drinking water wells that serve the area. So that's a problem. That's way above the EPA level, and it's certainly way above what we consider to be safe. And then in October 2019, PFOA and PFOS combined were found in untreated groundwater that was tested to be at 136 to 148 parts per trillion. And that was in 8 private water wells. The source there is not like the other 2 firefighting foams. It's metal plating businesses, Peninsula Plating Site and the Prosino Plating Site. Peninsula is closed down. Prosino is still operating. They've had to put certain measures in place in order not to release it to the environment anymore. But when it was discovered, bottled water was given out until a granular activated carbon system was put on the water wells that serve the entire area. And so PFOA and PFOS in this instance, but the PFAS are now removed below the EPA's health advisory level. What exactly they are, we don't know. I'm not going to be able to tell you, but you can find out by going to your community water system report to find out how low it is. It should be, we believe, non-detect, or certainly not above the very low single digits. And in September of 2020, EPA added the Blades groundwater site to the national priority list for Superfunds. So that's good news, because that means federal money to help clean up the site. One problem, of course, that we've talked about is its presence in drinking water and the importance of removing it from drinking water. But the other side of this problem is it has to be cleaned up from the environment. We not only have to know where it is and what the sources are, but the reason to know where the source is so you can get in there and clean it up. And you can clean it up by filtration, then you have to dispose of the residue as basically a hazardous substance, but it can be removed. Let's look next at Dover Air Force Base. In 2014, there was testing done of raw groundwater, and they found 290,000 parts per trillion on the base. Now that's not in the well, it was in the groundwater. And in 2016, there was one private well. They started sampling around the site, around outside of the perimeter of the Air Force Base, and they did find a private well that had PFAS above 70 parts per trillion, and they did put an activated carbon filtration system on it in order to remove it. Again, how low, I don't know. And so then for a couple of years between 2016 and 2018, there was more sampling done, and I can't believe this number, but it's from the Union of Concerned Scientists report, who went through and added up all of the PFAS compounds that were found during that period in the groundwater, and together it's 2,800,000 parts per trillion. And the 4th highest level of the 2 chemicals among 131 US military bases is this number. So fourth highest in the entire nation. And this is on the site in groundwater. In 2019, a combination of PFOS and PFOA reached between 1,800 and 170,000 parts per trillion in 4 wells. They discovered this doing, again, sampling, and those 4 wells serve 5 businesses, an office building, a couple of homes, and in 2020, by April, filtration systems were installed and should be removing the PFOS and the PFOA. And in 2019, right now, there are 2 more wells being investigated. I only know this from looking at news articles because we don't have information that tells us what, since they started investigating these 2 wells, has actually occurred. It's been several months. We know that the source here of the contamination is aqueous film-forming firefighting foams, or AFFF, and that firefighting foam that I talked about that they have used on military bases was often used in practice runs. They would do various testing practices in order to a plane were to come down and you would need to put out the fire. They would practice with these foams. And in some places, like in Bucks and Montgomery County, they did this once a week for decades, these tests or these drills that they would have in order to, get down their process of how to put out a terrible fire. But as a result of not having any containment over all these decades of these foams that were being spewed into the air and then also forming rivulets that go into the groundwater and surface water, we end up with a lot of the material that was sprayed in the environment and then making its way into our groundwater, our surface water, and then also into fish and wildlife, and of course into human beings. So the last one I want to look at here in terms of the 3 hot spots that we know about in Delaware is Newcastle County Airport and the Air National Guard base there. We know that 7 square miles have been contaminated. In 2014, the city of Newcastle municipal wells were found to have PFOA of 440 parts per trillion and PFOS of 2,300 parts per trillion. And the artesian water company Wilmington Manor well also had very high levels, PFOA of 140, PFOS between 932 and 1,800, and PFHXS was found from ND means non-detect up to 680 parts per trillion, and another compound PFHPA up to 80 parts per trillion. And then also the artesian Jefferson Farms well groundwater for that was tested and found to have 180 of PFOS, 50 of PFHXS, and 30 of PFHPA. And in 2015, the airport monitoring well showed PFOS. EPA went in and started sampling there in order to chase down the source further and find out what the levels were. In 2016, they did find through sampling wells outside of the airport and the guard base properties that one residential well, well, actually, this one was actually on the airport, was 57.1 parts per trillion. Then 3 years of study between 15 and 18 on the Delaware Air National Guard base showed very high levels, PFOS, 7,900 parts per trillion in the groundwater there. Now, the military base is using the EPA's health advisory level of 70 parts per trillion to trigger action in order to clean up a well. So levels below that, they're not addressing. And it's the same for the private wells outside of the property. If the military base is responsible, they only address those wells that exceed 70 parts per trillion or greater. So these problems that we have, as you can see, are in the groundwater, and the issue of removing it is a big one that will take a long time. Remember, even if they've stopped, because these do not biodegrade in the environment, they stay there, they're forever chemicals. Even if they've stopped using materials that contain PFAS, they're still there. And decades have gone by in some places. I mean, In New Jersey, there's places that stopped using them in 2010, and in 2020, extremely high levels remain in the groundwater. And most of these places are being addressed through drinking water systems, but the groundwater, the soils, the sediments, fish, surface water are still contaminated. Just to finish up on the Newcastle County Airport, because there's a lot going on there, it is again those firefighting foams, but there was action taken right away. Artesian shut down those wells that had those high levels in 2014, and they put carbon filtration on, and they returned one of those wells with the carbon filtration system on. And in 2015, the city of Newcastle did the same thing. They put filtration on, and all of the affected water wells were returned to service with filtration. And then in 2019, a really important study has begun in Newcastle County, and that is the Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Registry, ATSDR. I mentioned them earlier with those minimum risk levels. They are offering free medical testing for PFAS compounds to a random selection of households in Newcastle near the Army Guard base, the National Guard base. And this is for people who may have had PFAS in their drinking water. Now, they can't go back in time and find out, did you have it in your water, say, in 2010? But what they can do is take blood samples and find out if you have it in your blood. And this is very important, what they call exposure assessments, because it's telling people whether or not they've been affected by drinking this water for all this time. Most people who've been drinking contaminated water had no idea, and they've been doing it for decades. So by actually testing the blood, they can find out, has it accumulated in your body, and has it accumulated to a level that can have adverse health effects. This study is ongoing, and I have a link at the very end here about how you can get in touch with them, because it's really important that this sort of health study be done. I'm going to quickly go through the fact sheet that ATSDR put out. And we can't, of course, read this, but what I really want to point out on each of these slides is that just some of the highlights, 214 people were sampled, and that represented 134 households. And this is a study amongst 8 other studies in the United States. And Newcastle County is special. It was chosen by the federal government for this study as one of 8 throughout the United States. And this is what they found. These are the preliminary findings. 99% of the participants had PFH excess. And just so you know what that is, PFH excess has often been used as a substitute for PFOS, which is one of the major components in firefighting foam. And it was found in 99% of the people. There has not been a lot of study done on this chemical, but we do know that it is toxic, and we do know that it's persistent in the environment, and it's bioaccumulative. It's also used in consumer products. 95% of the participants had PFOA in their blood. 91% had PFOS. 86% had PFNA, which has 9 carbon atoms, as I mentioned before, which means it's even more highly toxic than PFOA and PFOS in lower doses. And then PFDA, 84%. So these people, residents of the area that were tested, were found to have higher levels above the national average. And these percentages are the levels above the national average. And then I'd just also like to point out that the PFAS levels in the blood, compared to these other 8 studies that are going on across the nation, in Newcastle County, the 5th highest out of 8 for PFOS. It's the 2nd highest for PFHXS, and the 5th highest for PFOA. So Newcastle County is not the worst. It's next to it's almost the worst for PFHXS, and it's certainly high on the list for PFOA and PFOS. And this is very worrying. These results comparing the people in Newcastle County with the rest of the nation, regular folks, and the average levels found have higher levels because of their exposure to these compounds in drinking water. So one thing that, this is the last slide on this, one thing that ATSDR says is they really don't predict health effects from this, but they are learning more about the direct effects from the multi-state studies that are going on. And as we talked about throughout this evening's slideshow, we do know that there are health effects that are correlated or linked to exposure, particularly to PFOA and PFOS, the two that are most commonly found. So there's been a lot of study on that. So we know there are health effects that are linked to it, and the exact health effects, like the prediction, you can't actually predict if you're going to get, for instance, kidney disease or a certain cancer, but you know that your risk of developing it is greater if you have higher levels in your drinking water and therefore higher levels in your blood. So, many communities are fighting for this, to get this blood screening. So it is really important that Newcastle County is having this ATSDR study. And, people have been fighting to have that come to their community. And this community actually is going to have a blood study done. That was in Bucks and Montgomery counties in Pennsylvania. And this slide is just to show you that the problem is continuing. PFOA in the most recent report, the water quality report from a major water company, Artesian, and for 2019, which is the most recent year that's available, is still, still shows PFOA in the water. And the level is 20 parts per trillion, or down to non-detect. They give the range detected. They don't give a lot of other information here, but we do know, because of levels that have been adopted by other states, that even that 20 is a problem. For instance, New Jersey has adopted for PFOA 14 parts per trillion. That was done in 2017. For PFOS, they've adopted 13 parts per trillion in 2019. And for PFNA, 13 parts per trillion. That was done in 2018. And these figures are much, much lower than the health advisory level for EPA. And other states have gone even lower than that. And some researchers, such as Professor Grandjean from Harvard, says that 1 parts per trillion is the level that it should be reduced down to. And as I said, we think it should be non-detect. Really, that's the moral stand that we should have, because we didn't put this here. People are drinking it without knowing it, and it doesn't belong in our drinking water. And then I would also, so I'm not picking on Artesian, I'm just using it because that's their, this is the most recent water quality report from that company. But the problem is continuing. It is continuing to be in our water. So just to recap everything here. The biggest problems for Delaware in terms of PFAS are that Delaware uses the EPA health advisory level of 70 parts per trillion, and it's not protective of human health. No state-based or federal maximum contaminant level for any PFAS in the state of Delaware. PFAS presence in the water. We know it's there. We know that. And Delaware Riverkeeper Network did file a FOIA with the state of Delaware to get information that we were hoping to actually share through webinars this summer. However, Delaware has a very weird condition in its Freedom of Information Act request. And that is that you have to be a resident of Delaware in order to get that data. So we had a very generous resident of Delaware that stepped up, a member of Delaware Riverkeeper Network, who filed the FOIA for us and made it very clear in the FOIA that the information was going to be coming to us, but it took a very long time. We tried as an organization to get it for a couple of months, and then mainly, I don't know, maybe it's because of COVID and the shutdown, but it did take a long time, way beyond what FOIA is supposed to take to get the information to our member who promptly got it to us. We have posted that data on our website. And I have the link on the last slide. And Peter from Delaware Riverkeeper Network, who's our troubleshooter tonight and running the program here tonight, is putting it into the chat box for you. So that data, we're hoping to go through and comb through. We just got it this month, so we weren't able to do it for tonight, and we already have enough material anyway. But we're hoping and planning to have a future webinar where we and report that really dig into that data. One problem that we see from the data that we received, and we know we're going to have to file another FOIA now, is it only goes up to 2015, and we asked for the most recent data. So there's a lot of problems there. But we do know that we have PFA in the water in Delaware. Not every single person has it in all their water supplies, but we know it's enough of a problem that it needs to be addressed by a statewide regulation. There's not enough drinking water sampling or health studies that can really tell us where exactly it is and where all the sources are, because there could be more sources. And if you don't know the sources, you're not going to know how to clean it up. There's also a lack of public disclosure. Most people just don't know what's in the water. And unless your system is tested for a PFAS compound because you're on one of those hot spots that we talked about earlier, you're not going to know whether it's in there because they don't have to test for it. And then the state has made some troubling, state representatives have made some troubling statements, recently. And I have these two bit.lys at the bottom here to show you where it came from. But this is all, recent. It was said by DENREC that they have no plans to search for PFCs, that's the same thing as PFAS, but it's a subclass of that, and other Delaware municipalities, and officials are still unsure of the full extent of the contamination found in blades and nearby private wells. Why isn't there going to be more sampling? There should be, and they should be saying right away they're doing it. And then also another statement from a different article, without results showing any exceedances of the health advisory level existing, there's no recommendation for homeowners or public water owners to take either action at this time. That is action to put filtration systems on your home. But as we've discussed, we don't believe the health advisory level, and many states and scientists don't believe that it is protective. So just because we don't have a lot of places that have already been found above the HAL doesn't mean that action shouldn't be taken to remove these highly toxic compounds from your drinking water. And clean, safe water, it's a constitutional right. And we believe the state should step up here, and it's wrong that there has not been regulatory action taken by Delaware when there's such a problem. And finally, we have some informational links here, and we're really close to our end time. So I want to throw it open to questions and answers right now. And I don't know if we have any, but maybe I'll leave the links up in case someone does want to right away go to some of them. But Peter, do we have any questions in the Q&A or in the chat that I can try to address?
Yeah, it looks like we have one question from Liz, and I think she's referring to a specific slide that you showed earlier. She asks, in the one slide with levels of the different chemicals in Newcastle versus other places, there are bars for general US population, and she's wondering if that's the national average.
Oh, you're talking about in the health study? Yes.
Let's see.
I'm sorry, I don't understand the question exactly.
I think she said
the numbers below show the percentage of the participants with PFA levels above the national average. So they had it in their blood, and they also had it above the national average. I hope that answers your question.
If you could go one slide forward.
Oh, this bars, okay. So these are the averages that were found amongst all the participants who had blood drawn. And these are the levels, the average levels of PFOS, for instance, for Newcastle County was 21.5. And then the average for PFOA was 5. For PFHXS, it was 20.1. So, and the bars are stacked up to show you what the other places showed.
Yeah, and I think she's referring to the light green bar where it's the general US population, which is,
Yes. Oh, on the bottom, yes, that's where the general US population number is. So that's called NHANES, and everybody in the United States on average has about 4.7 PFOS in their blood and 1.2 of PFHXS in their blood and 1.5, these are parts per trillion, of PFOA average in their blood. So me sitting here or you sitting there without being exposed to Newcastle County's residents' level of exposure through drinking water already have this much in your blood. And then the averages amongst the participants in this blood study were higher than that, 21.5 and 20.1 and then 5. So it's higher than the national average. And they believe the reason is because it does accumulate in your blood. And as that slide about the EPA Hal showed, it builds up in your blood, it amplifies 100 to 1. So you're drinking water and it's accumulating and building up in your blood. That's what makes it so dangerous for a fetus, for instance.
all right. We have another question from James, and he's asking about bottled water and whether or not the content of bottled water has been tested for PFAS or PFOS.
Right. It's not required that bottled water is tested for PFAS. However, there is really good information on some websites. And the third one here, the Environmental Working Group, has really good information about various consumer products. And I believe they look at different bottled water brands and tell you what the results are. There have been quite a few investigations, not a lot, but independent, mainly nonprofit groups that have looked at bottled water in order to decipher what's exactly in them. And it's pretty disturbing because it is found that many bottled water companies don't test for PFAS. Some do it voluntarily, and most of them you can find out by Googling and going to their website, and they'll tell you. That's what I've done. I've gone to the website of, for instance, Poland Spring or something like that, and they will tell you whether or not they test for it, and they'll tell you what the results of their sampling. So it is an important question because many people, for instance, at Blades, they were given bottled water because the drinking water through the public system was found to be highly contaminated with PFAS. But how much were they getting from the bottled water? Also, many of us drink bottled water for health reasons instead of, soda or, other sorts of drinks. And you really want to make sure you're not dosing yourself with PFAS because it's not required. It's not that bottled water companies test for it. It's actually a very poorly regulated industry.
We have another question from Peter, and he wants to know how much it costs to get your water tested.
Well, it really varies. It depends also on, do you want a full assay? A lot of the PFAS compounds looked at, do you want to target just ones that you think, because for instance, you're near one of these hot spots, do you want to target just the ones that we've talked about tonight that we know were found by other labs when they tested the water? But it's going to cost you at least $300, and it could cost you several $100s. It depends on the lab. But I know, for instance, Delaware Riverkeeper Network had our own water at our office sampled and taken to a lab, and it cost us $300. And that was in Pennsylvania. But there are good labs. That used to be very difficult to get this testing done. But as I mentioned at the start, the testing methods are routine now. Many labs are certified to test for PFAS, and it used to be very, very expensive. When we first did testing at Delaware Riverkeeper Network back in 2005, when we were doing investigations of PFAS before it was an issue. We had to send it off to Canada in order to get an independent lab, and it cost us thousands of dollars. Of course, we had to, it wasn't something we could afford to do a lot, but we did actually break the issue open into the public by doing that sampling and handing it into DEP. It's one of the reasons they move forward and with regulations much sooner than any other state. So, you know, it is good to get your water tested. If you're unsure, if you're, you know, if you just want to have peace of mind, doing the testing is worth it. And then whole house systems are usually what are recommended. Carbon filtration and sometimes, you know, combined with reverse osmosis can be put on your home. For instance, if you have an individual water well, or even if you're on public supplies, if you want to be cautious, you can, and they do run into the thousands. But the price is coming down. You know, the one advantage of more just, you know, awareness of this issue is that technology is developing, and a lot of companies are getting involved in supplying filtration systems and you know, testing that's more affordable than it used to be. Well, I think we're at 8 o'clock, and I know some people are probably going to watch a debate that's coming on, or at least the talk show before the debate. And we really want to honor you by finishing on time. If you think of some question, you can go ahead and send it in to us at Delaware Riverkeeper Network. And I just realized, and Peter, maybe you can put my email address into the chat box. I just realized I didn't put it on this informational link, but we'll get back to you. Also, please look for a notice. Everybody who registered for tonight is going to receive a notice when it's on, when the webinar is posted on our website, and we'll, you know, be able to also send you further information and hook you up if you want to be on our e-activist list to know about further forums that we're going to be holding in the coming weeks and months. Thank you all very much. We really appreciate you joining us tonight. Please share this information with others, and we hope to make this more of an issue as we move into the future, because we think it deserves the attention because of the toxicity of this problem. Thank you all very much.